I watched the white lines in the middle of the highway disappear one by one under the hood of my car as I sped down the interstate. If I watched them long enough, they would eventually just bleed into one long, hazy line of white in a sea of asphalt. And then I would snap out of my stare, and they would separate again. I reached over to the passenger side seat and grabbed my pint of gin. It's sad how good I've gotten at twisting the cap off with one hand, while the other's on the wheel. I took a big swig and finished the bottle, then tossed it out of my driver's window, and heard the glass shatter in a satisfying splash. That had to have been microsleep, I kept telling myself. I don't know if I was finally starting to lose it or if I'd already drunk too much by noon and was just rambling, but I had to somehow rationalize the fact that I'd seen Ubloo and not heard him afterwards. In the end, I chalked it up to hallucinations brought on by the lack of sleep, and told myself that I would try to get at least 5 hours tonight. For the past few weeks, I've been running on just about 4 hours a night, or however long I can stomach those terrifying nightmares. In my rearview mirror, I checked the box that housed Robert Jennings' things. Today was finally the day that I would learn what that book meant. I can't tell you how long I compared this writing to samples on my laptop for it. And it wasn't until a very blind stroke of luck that I finally figured out what it actually was. I was sitting at a hotel bar in Pennsylvania when a man came and sat next to me. We made some small talk at first, but I think he was scared off a little bit by my disheveled appearance. We drank in silence for a few minutes, and then he broke it abruptly. "You can read that shit?" he said all but gracefully. "Unfortunately, no," I sighed. "In fact, I'm just trying to figure out what language it is, to be completely honest." "Oh." He looked down at his beer and started picking at the label. "Mind if I take a look?" "Sure, just be careful with it, please." I slid the book over to him carefully. He opened the front cover and flipped through the first couple pages. "Well, I'll tell you," he began. "It's some sort of African writing." My ears perked up at this. "African?" I asked hopefully. "Yeah, I used to be a security guard at the National History Museum over in New York City. I swear I saw some shit just like this there." I didn't even bother thanking the man. I grabbed the book from him and sprinted up to my hotel room to begin working. I must have wrote damn near 500 emails that night, with a small sample of the writing attached, to every African history professor, museum curator, and African language translator I could find an address for. And that is how I met Eli. Eli was a retired African history professor living in Natchez, Mississippi. The email he sent back seemed a little surprised and excited all at once. He told me that this writing was an almost extinct language that he learned translating documents for a professor while studying for his doctorate. I told him that I would pay any sum of money should he help me translate this book, as long as I hand-delivered it to him and he reads it directly to me. I couldn't risk losing this book in the mail. And besides, Natchez was right on my route to Louisiana. I finished reading Robert's journal about 2 weeks ago. He wrote about the dreams, how hard the burden was to bear, and how it was affecting his family life. Robert went knocking on one of his tenants' doors after not hearing from him for weeks. He let himself in and found him there with wrists slit in the bathtub. Apparently, a pair of his old jeans were lying on the bathroom floor, and in a pocket Robert found a picture of the Louisiana house, with the address hastily scribbled on the back of it. I found it curious that he made no mention of where he found the other book, though. Robert also theorized about what exactly Ubloo was trying to do. He seemed to believe it was some vengeful spirit feeding on our nightmares or fear. Truth be told, his journal wasn't actually very useful. It was simply a recording of everything he'd been through in the 3 years he dealt with this curse. I snapped out of my thoughts just in time to hear her scream, and then a big crash as my windshield spiderwebbed inward. I swerved out of instinct and lost control of the car. It veered off the highway and down the embankment, throwing the woman from my hood and sending her ragdolling across the landscape until she was finally stopped by a tree. And I heard her spine snap from the whiplash with a sharp pop. My car finally slid to a stop, and then I heard him. "Oh my God, Mary!" An old man was running down the embankment now over to where the woman lay. "Mary, sweetheart, please!" He knelt down and cradled her in his arms, her legs twisted into sickening shapes. He looked at me, still in shock, knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel. It wasn't until I'd had half a moment to collect myself that I realized the gravity of what just happened. "Back up, I'm a doctor!" I yelled, opening the door and running halfway to the man. "She's dead, you idiot! You killed her!" The old man sobbed into the hair on the top of his wife's head. I stopped halfway between the car and the tree. The two of them couldn't have been younger than 70. A little up the road, I noticed a car pulled off the side of the road. They must have broken down or gotten a flat. She was probably trying to flag me down, or maybe just standing too far into the lane. I'm sorry," I stammered out, choking up. "I wasn't paying attention." "You were fucking drunk, you idiot!" he snapped back at me. "A drunk just like your old man. That's what killed him, and what killed your mother, too." I was taken aback by this. "No, that's not true." "It is." The old man reached behind his back and pulled out a revolver. "Look what you've done, boy. It's all your fault." And with that, he cocked the revolver, put it in his mouth, and I watched his brains splatter out of the back of his head in a burst of color. I stood there in shock, listening to the still silence of the aftermath. I scratched the back of my head. How the fuck am I going to get out of this? I scratched the back of my head again. What an odd moment for it to be tickling like this. Then I felt my hair ruffle. I spun on my heel, surprised and scared. And there he was, his long trunk recoiling back towards his head, and the long, black, pointed tongue hanging lazily out the end of it. He stared at me with those deep, black, horrible eyes. So black, I could see my reflection in them. The reflection of me standing there frozen in fear. He bobbed slowly up on his legs and back down, almost gracefully. His head cocked to the side with just a fraction of an inch, and without any movement I heard it. "Ubloo!" I woke up to a gasp of hot, stale air, and the world came back to me slowly as I drank in my surroundings. And then everything flooded back at once. I'd pulled over at a rest stop just outside of Natchez to take a leak and grab a coffee. I must have fallen asleep in the car. Fuck! I slammed my hand into the steering wheel. I must have had 50 dreams with this thing at least, and yet he still somehow managed to catch me off guard. I reached into my center console and pulled out the pill bottle of Adderall. I threw 2 in my mouth and forced them down with a swig of gin. For a second I sat there, head against the steering wheel, fighting off my thoughts. And then I turned the key and started the car, and left the rest stop parking lot. It took me about another half hour to get to where Eli lived. His house was large and old from the looks of it. His driveway was much longer than I was used to. The land surrounding his house stretched on for what seemed like forever. I guess city living had made a place like this seem unnatural to me. I drove my car to the front of his house and he came outside and waved. He was about my height but much older, in his late 60s. He had a full head of white hair and a white goatee to match it. His skin was wrinkled and he had a pair of half-framed glasses resting on his nose. He lit up a cigarette as I got out of the car and stretched my legs. "Afternoon, Doctor," he called from his front steps. "I must say I have been mighty looking forward to this book of yours. You can't find much that hadn't been found already. And if I have the chance to translate some new discovery as well, I guess we could call us even." He spoke with a thick accent, but he was understandable. He looked me over for a few seconds and then spoke again. "But my, you do look terrible, Doctor. Long drive, I say." "No, just a rough night." I couldn't help but smile at that. I opened the back door of my car and pulled the book out of its box. I shut the door and then studied the cover one last time, in mystery, as I walked over to Eli. Here she is, I said, handing over the book. Eli took the book in his hands and pushed his glasses up to get a better look. He squinted at the cover in the sunlight for about 3 seconds before I saw his eyes widen and his mouth open slightly. "Doctor," he said gravely, "where did you find this?" "It was given to me by a friend," I lied. "But only half." "Why, what is it called?" Eli turned and stared at me for a long time, and I could almost see the gears in his head turning as he was starting to realize just why I looked so haggard. "It's a religious text," he started, his voice wavering. "Written by a witch doctor from the Banuma tribe." "Witch doctor?" I asked curiously. "Like voodoo?" "Yes, doctor." Eli turned to look at me as he spoke. "But not just any voodoo. The Banuma tribe, and most specifically this witch doctor, are referred to in African folklore as one of the most ruthless in history." We stood there for a moment together on his front steps, with only the sound of the wind to keep us company. "Well, doctor," Eli began, "let's go inside and make sure that this ain't a fake before we jump into such rash conclusions." We went inside together, and Eli brought me to his study. He began examining the book, the text, the paper, everything. And while he did this, he had me running about doing various tasks for him, pulling samples from his filing cabinets, looking up texts that he didn't have on the internet, fetching sweet tea from the fridge. After about 2 hours, he finally sat back in his chair and turned to look at me. "God Almighty, Doctor, this is the real deal." I was overjoyed to hear this. Truth be told, I hadn't even considered the possibility that the text was fake. And now that I was just minutes from answers about Ubloo, about how to stop or kill him, I finally felt a weight lift a little from my shoulders. "So I tell you what," Eli began. "I have a guest bed upstairs. If you have nowhere else to be, you can shack up with me here, and we can translate this book in, I don't know, 3 days." My stomach dropped. "I'm sorry, Eli, but that's just too much time." He looked back up at me again. "I need to be back on the road by sundown." He looked surprised, and rightfully so. "Hell, boy, you look like you haven't slept in days. Surely you can take one night off from the road." "I'm sorry, but I'm running out of time." I got up, and I walked over to where Eli had the book. "May I?" "Well, of course, Doctor. It's yours after all." I flipped through the pages to the chapter I needed. "Not anymore, Eli," I said as I got closer to the text I had to hear. "Once I leave, this is yours. Do whatever you like with it." I stopped finally on the page I needed. A crude picture of Ubloo stared at me, surrounded by text. "Please, this is the text I need," I said before he could ask anything. Eli turned down to the page and read in silence for a few minutes, and as he did, I could see him understand. When he was finally done, he turned and looked at me with big, sad eyes. "How long?" he asked. "About 2 months," I said back, my heart breaking with finally being able to tell someone who would understand. "Jesus," he said, trailing off, and then, "One moment, Doctor." He got up and walked to the kitchen, and came back with a tray. 2 glasses full with ice, and a bottle of what looked like whiskey. I laughed, and for just a second felt human again. Eli poured me a glass, and then him, and we drank together in silence. "So now you understand why I can't stay," I finally said. "I do, Doctor. Now you might want to sit down for this, because it's quite a long story." I took a seat next to Eli and braced myself, heart racing for what was coming next. This creature, this thing, is called Dialabuumba. Dialabuumba? I asked curiously, feeling odd that these people didn't come up with the same name both Robert and Andrew had. Yes, Dialabuumba. It translates to the one who shows. A shiver ran down my spine as Eli continued on. It says here that this witch doctor was very powerful, and that his people, the Benuma tribe, were being chased across the desert by a rival clan. Rather than the clan face them down in battle, they sent their best warriors into the Benuma camp at night and slaughtered them in their sleep. The witch doctor was away, praying to the gods for his people to escape. But the gods had abandoned him for using voodoo to defeat his enemies, and his prayers were not answered. When he returned to camp, he found all of his tribe slaughtered in their beds, including his wife, who was with child. The witch doctor was overcome with grief and hatred, and turned to his most powerful voodoo to exact vengeance on the rival clan, and abandoned the gods that turned their backs on him. He gathered everything of use he could find left behind by the raid. Elephant tusks, snake skins, animal bones, and anything that had any significant properties. He piled them together with the bodies of his fallen tribe and burned them all, chanting a voodoo curse all the while. A curse to be placed on the rival clan, to summon a spirit that would haunt their sleep the way they haunted his tribes. Eli stopped and looked up at me. "Do you want me to keep going, Doctor?" I took a sip of my whiskey and solemnly nodded. In a matter of days, the rival clan were all having horrific nightmares and could not sleep. They dreamt of being raided by other tribes and seeing their women and children raped or enslaved, of crops burning and dry seasons that would never end. Before long, the clan turned on each other or took their own lives, until none remained at all. But something was wrong. When the witch doctor heard that the clan was destroyed, he celebrated. But he continued to hear of people being affected by the one who shows. He realized that the beast he made could not be stopped, for it had an appetite for despair that could not be satisfied. One by one, people would be affected by the spirit, and when they died, it would pass on to another, and so on, and so on. He stopped and looked back up at me and stared. "Well, could they stop it?" I asked. "It doesn't say," Eli said through his sadness. "It says that the tribes began to exile anyone who contracted the deadly spirit, for it was impossible to fight, leaving the spirit to be contracted by a different tribe." My stomach dropped entirely. Well, that's it. There's no escape for me. I'm just going to have to deal with Ubloo for as long as I live, or as short as I live. I see now why Andrew and Robert took their lives. My eyes began to well up, and Eli poured me another glass of whiskey. "I'll understand if you want to get back on the road, Doctor. I'll keep translating, and I'll call you if I find anything that helps." I gulped down the whiskey in one shot and wiped my eyes on my sleeve. "Thanks, Eli," I forced out. "Let me know. I'll show myself out." I got up before he could stop me and headed for the front door. Before I could get down to my car, Eli was in the doorway and called out to me. "Doctor, just where is it you're going? If you don't mind my asking," he said. The sadness on his voice made the question hang in the evening air. "To follow a dead man's footsteps," I answered. "That led to somewhere in Louisiana." Eli stared back at me and his eyes began to well up with tears. "Well, I wish you the best, Doctor. I can't imagine the things you've seen and I won't pretend to, but God bless you for fighting. I nodded and opened my car door, but stopped and looked up at Eli. Diala Buumba, I said with a half laugh. That's a lot better than what I've been calling it. What have you been calling it, Doctor? I stopped for a second and thought about just how silly the name I had for him was. Ubloo, I said with a half smile. Ubloo? Eli looked at me confused. Yeah, that's what it says to me right at the end of every dream. I hesitated. Does it mean anything? Eli looked down at me with a stare I will never forget. A look in his eyes that I know he will never give to another man in his life. And he said, Yes, Doctor. Ubloo is short for Ubualu. The wind blew gently between us, and the grass swayed in the waning sunlight, as I awaited what would most likely be the last thing I'd ever hear from him. It means, wake up.